And okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to our fourth lesson, our fourth week of the Chesed voice in Jewish text. Um, so we're going to be talking about the prophets today, and we will jump right into it. So as a reminder, as we kind of get started, this is our fourth class, so we have covered the Chesed voice in Talmud and Torah, and in Ruth and Ezra. And unfortunately, we didn't have time to get into Psalms. Um, and then today we're going to be talking about the prophets, that middle part of the Jewish Bible. And in particular, we'll be looking at Jeremiah and Hosea. We'll also look at Micah. And our goal, of course, is to understand this tension between the Chesed voice and the law voice, or what I call Team Chesed and Team Law. As a reminder, Chesed, it's a kindness that goes above and beyond what is required to support other people. And there's an element of kind of long-term relationship that is that is required here. It's not just a I'll help you, you help me. It's really, again, a long-term commitment. We talk about the mitzvah or the mitzvot. Those are the commandments from God that are used as the basis for Jewish law. And Chesed is itself a mitzvah, and it's also a sephirah in Kabbalah, and it's a soul trait in Musar, and it's also an attribute of the divine. And when we look at sort of these characteristics, just as a reminder, since it's been a couple of weeks, the legal voice tends to emphasize things like obedience to God, in particular the mitzvot in Torah, whereas the Chesed voice really looks at learning all of Torah, which includes like the whole book of Genesis and the stories and um, the kind of examples of the characters. It's about understanding God, knowing God, as opposed to just obeying God. And a difference in whether you make global rules the highest priority or whether you prioritize the individual and individual merit. And our actions are guided by the rules and mitzvot for team law, but for team chesed, it's about walking in God's ways and using God's attributes and human examples for how we're to show up. So let me just pause here. Any sort of questions or comments so far? Are we all on the same page? Okay, I see thumbs up, nods, fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, he was a priest. He was kind of in the inner circle, was sort of known to well, he wasn't in the inner circle, but he spoke to the royalty and he knew kind of all of the leaders. He's thought to be the author of the Book of Lamentations, and in the Book of Jeremiah, he is a witness to the destruction of the first temple. And in the book, he calls out a lot of the specific misconducts of the priests and the leaders and the people, but he also mixes that in with voices of hope for the future. So, first example, Jeremiah 9:12 to 13. Would one of you like to unmute and read the English?
Yeah, I'll read.
Thank
Okay.
you.
And the divine said, because they have forsaken my teaching, which I set before them, and have not hearkened to my voice, neither walked therein, but have walked after the stubbornness of their own heart, and after the Baalim which their fathers taught them.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple of things to point out here. First of all, this is um, translated as my teaching, but it says et Torati, my Torah. You know, they have forsaken, and Torah, it does mean teaching, but it's really sort of collectively like my wisdom. They've forsaken Well, and then also they have not hearkened to my voice nor walked therein. Now, we talked about walking in God's ways. This is a direct kind of callback to that idea. And also, you may remember in our very first or second session, we talked about the Shema, and Shema means like listening, means truly hearing. And so, you haven't listened to my voice, you haven't followed my teaching, but you've become preoccupied with yourself. You have uh, become inwardly focused and walking after the Baalim, these are idols. So you become idolaters, you become idol worshippers. You're not following in my ways. And this is a very holistic view. It's all of the teachings, it's all of the Torah. So it would include not following the mitzvot. Uh, and also, but just not walking in God's ways, not being a good person, not doing acts of chesed. Um, so we'll look at this in a minute, but let me pause here. Comments, what sort of stands out to you about this? I've just sort of given my take on it.
My first thought was idol worship,
Mhm.
and then everything else comes after that.
Yeah.
Kind of like a giving up, you know. It's just a giving over or giving up and not everything else is, I guess, commentary, I suppose, but that's what my first thought was.
Yeah, thank you. And it's almost like they're making these equivalents between not studying Torah and idol worship. So it's kind of, if you're not going to take your direction from the Torah or from the divine, you're going to be taking it from somewhere else and something else. And, in my own personal story and my own personal experience, when I was really stuck in the workaholic world, I realized that I had turned my employer into a false idol. I was doing what was best for the company. I wasn't doing what was best. And my values were out of alignment. And when I realigned my values, then my life came back into focus and came back into balance.
I'm really struck by the phrase stubbornness of their own heart. Um, and yet, like, so that really stuck out as in opposition to the divine teachings. Um, and yet, the idea of the teachings of their fathers, um, at least on first glance, teachings of your father sounds like something you would want to follow. And
Mm,
so it's a contrast of, sort of what you were inherited or what you were given, as opposed to sort of choosing the divine teachings.
mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah, thank you for lifting that up, Sarah, because it is quite striking. And we do learn from our parents, we do learn from our families. And if we're kind of taught stubbornness, or if our families are teaching us values which are not the right ones, or not, quote, the best ones, it's that much harder for us to kind of live in the world in the right way. Did I understand you? Is that kind of the point you were making? Yeah, thank you.
And then I'm almost also thinking about what you were saying, Greg, about um, hope that Jeremiah gave was a voice of hope in the long run. And I'm
Mhm.
thinking this, if you just read these and you it's like there's a hopelessness to it, but then you look at what you were saying about is that at Torati,
Mhm.
there's your path back
Yeah.
to if you can turn like Sarah was saying, your heart, if you can turn your heart back. So it's like
Mhm.
deconstructing this in a way and finding the hope in it that Jeremiah is so famous for.
Yeah, and of course the one Hebrew word for turning is teshuvah. Like that's what it means to do repentance, to turn your heart back. So yeah, I love that. Thank you. That's a good segue to this next section. So this is a few verses later, also in chapter 9. Okay, so we've sort of left off when people were kind of being arrogant in their hearts. And then I think the Jeremiah goes on that vein for a while, and then it sort of takes this turn. So Wendy, do you want to read this
Sure.
one?
Thus said the divine, let not the wise person glory in their wisdom. Let not the strong person glory in their strength. Let not the rich person glory in their riches. But only in this should one glory, that they understand and know me, that I am the divine, who exercises Hesed, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord.
Thank you. Okay, so what's going on here? What are you noticing about this text? What are some of the contrasts?
I just think that get your mind off of yourself and get your mind on me,
Yeah,
the divine.
yeah,
But I love it says, who exercises Hesed, justice, and righteousness. It's beautiful attributes of the divine.
yeah. It doesn't say, get your mind on me and all these commandments and laws that I've set before you, right? There's a very strong, I would argue, Chesed voice here that we're seeing. Don't be all arrogant about your accomplishments. Focus on, understanding and knowing God, right? That's a hallmark. This is kind of where I take part of where I take this idea that what the Chesed voice wants is us to understand what the divine really is about, and how is that defined by a God of Chesed and justice and righteousness.
I also
And
just love the contrast of let not the something person glory in that something. Like that, yes, this is you have this great wisdom or this great strength or wealth, but that you shouldn't take so much. I mean, glory is sort of a funny word, but sort of bask in it or take too much pride in
mhm,
these things that are these very high attributes, but that the focus should be on, other things. And when you're thinking about Hesed and justice and righteousness, like, of course, you're thinking about God, but you're also going to be thinking about other people and the community and your family. And, you'll think more expansively than just sort of focusing in on whatever your personal
mhm.
high points are.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I love that. Nothing wrong with being wise or rich, but it's not about that. Okay, so we're going to switch now from um, the slides over to the source sheet. If I can ever figure out how to stop sharing. There we go. So, okay, because there's another level that we can go to here. Let me just set up my Chrome on the correct page. There we go. Okay, so here's our source sheet. So this was kind of the pre-work on Joshua, which I sent you if you the optional stuff. So here we have again what we were looking at before, but there's this different translation. Um, this first one, they should understand and know me. I'm the divine who exercises chesed. But then there's this different translation that shows up in the 1985 and 2006 Jewish publication Society, but only in this should one glory in their earnest devotion to me. So what is the difference between knowing God and being devoted to God? Is that the same thing?
To me, knowing indicates familiarity and, understanding, but devotion, is action. It's more sort of showing and doing and,
Mhm.
um, I don't know, a continuation. Like you can say you know something and you could know it for a long time without really changing or doing very much, but devotion implies, I think, a continuation and, yeah, sort of leaning into that action.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I was going to say too. Keeping on. That you have all of this past knowledge, wisdom, glorying in God, but devotion is like you said, keeping on, staying connected.
Yeah, so the question, and I agree, it is more about connection and taking action, and ideally, sort of knowing God would lead to kind of more devotion, and I think that's implied. But also, do you need to know the divine to be devoted to the divine? I mean, for me, I see this as a little bit of an obedience. There's a little bit of an obedient, just be devoted to God, just do the stuff, and you don't really need to worry about things. It's not as obvious maybe in this one as in some of the others. The other thing is devotion is nowhere in the dictionary. This is not actually like the Hebrew is via via doa, yud daled ayin. Um, I checked with, my Hebrew professor with a PhD in Hebrew language. Devotion isn't really, if you kind of look at any of the online biblical dictionaries, it's not something that sort of comes in. So I'm a little suspicious about why they have chosen that particular word here. And we're going to look at a couple of other translations from these sort of same sources where I see a little bit of a pattern where they tend to underplay this idea of knowing and understanding God, and they seem to be more words that are akin to obedience or devotion, which is not as it's in a little bit of a middle ground, I think.
Greg,
Yeah.
could devotion uh, denote or connote trust? To me, kind of that kind of devotion is like a trust. What I've just gone through with these past, I don't know, 17 days or whatever it's been. Just that trust was constantly on
Mm.
my mind. Um, kind of devoted to something, not not that devotion would be the emotion or the verb, but it would be to something. Well, it says
Mhm.
to Hashem, but um, I don't know. Trust, I think trust may be part of devotion.
Yeah, I think those are good. I think that's an interesting connection, and it can absolutely can be. Yeah, I like that.
It's interesting. Like devotion is usually a word that I think of as associated with like, romantic partners or family members, a devoted spouse or a devoted son or, um, but I don't necessarily think it has to be obedient. It just has to be like that you're deeply connected to and that you really love. And there's like a high level of loyalty, I think, but not necessarily that you would just do everything for another person or the divine, but like you could be very devoted and still, I think, question or um contradict or there still could be tension in devotion, I think.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I may be taking a stronger, my objection may be stronger than is what's in the text on the surface. So,
Yeah, and I think, it is very interesting that devotion, you know, there's clearly some, I don't know, poetic license or something in choosing that word because it is not deeply devoted to the Hebrew text.
now,
And also the
Sorry, I
word
can't help myself.
and also the word earnest comes before devotion.
Hmm.
So it's almost like a decision that you're making. It's like a honest,
Mhm. Yeah.
I don't know, just kind of action. So it's
Yeah,
yeah,
it is.
I don't think it's meant to be more of a negative or more of an obedience sort of thing either.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we can call it a poetic translation. Let's change gears and look a little bit at Micah. So Micah was a first temple prophet, was actually prophesizing, or sorry, a prophet in Israel. So it's actually prophesizing against the northern kingdom, which was first destroyed by the Assyrians 100 years before, 100 years before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Babylonians. And so, but a lot of what he says, it's still very similar. Okay, so he's sort of looking ahead to the future at kind of a messianic time where many nations shall go and they'll say, come, let us go up to the mount of God, to the house of the God of Jacob. And this is talking about the temple here and the Temple Mount, that we may be instructed in God's ways and that we may walk in godly paths. So again, learning about God in order that we may emulate God or walk in godly paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. And the Hebrew here is Ki mitzion tetze Torah udevar Adonai mi Yerushalayim. So I see from your reactions, but maybe you can tell me where you seem to recognize that. Where do we hear that?
When the Torah is out.
Sure. Ki mitzion tetze Torah. Yeah,
Yeah. Every time we take
Torah
up the
study.
Torah, this is what we're saying. So it's Kimitzion Tetze Torah. Again, it's instruction that shall come from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. So that's like a poetic repetition, right? But what's the full context of this? What about the Torah when it's coming forth from Zion? What's it talking about here in the full verse? Is it
I mean, in
saying,
a lot of ways, oh, please.
no, no, go ahead, Sarah.
It's so interesting. Like, there's so much that we do in at synagogue that feels like instruction, and yet every time I feel like, depending on sort of how what sort of my intention is of being at shul, like I might pick up on something different. And I've probably sung this so, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of times across my life, and not really thought that much about the words. Like it's just sort of like, ah, yes, this is what we do before, as the Torah is out, um, and it's sort of, you can read it as fairly straightforward as, here's the Torah and it's the word of God from Jerusalem. Great. Um, but you can also read it, I think, in a deeper way of, really trying to think about whatever chapter and verse you've just read of Torah, and understanding it as, instructed in God's ways, and that it's really sort of your weekly, or if you're reading Torah more often, reminder of of where it all comes from.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And again, they chose, Micah, the writers of Micah chose the words carefully because in Deuteronomy it says in so many places, I mean, this could have say, I'll come up to the house of God that we may be instructed in God's laws and ordinances and customs. But it's not saying that. It's not saying those aren't part of it, but it's saying it's about God's ways and walking in godly paths. It's not saying that we may be sure to get our tefillin right and that, we follow all of the rituals correctly. This is it's a bigger vision.
It's beautiful, actually.
Yeah,
I
of
think
this.
one of the most important things that jumps out at me is God's ways. And going back to what uh, was in Jeremiah and what we were talking about in the beginning, what are God's ways? Those ways are the ones that are birthed from Hesed, justice, and righteousness.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking of the Talmud and how these brilliant scholars, sages, rabbis took hours and years and centuries and centuries going through figuring out the meaning of things according to God's ways, so that it broadens the law into a path that we can actually follow and not blindly, but because of knowing God.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, if you know kind of that God is showing up with Hesed and righteousness, and you don't know the law to help you in a particular situation, be like, okay, well, if I'm sort of leaning into Hesed and righteousness, oops, and we've been joined by Lila, the spiritual kitty here. Say hello. Whoops, okay, there she goes. Here we go. All right, Lila, well, we're going to go into Micah a little bit deeper. Okay, so here we're a couple chapters later into Micah. So we've had this walking in godly paths. So I don't know if you'd like to read these next two. Uh,
Okay, I'll read.
okay,
Would God be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of streams of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for my sins? You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what God requires of you, only to do justice and to love chesed and to walk modestly with your God.
thank you.
My favorite in all.
Very, very famous,
Yeah, I love it.
famous line. But it comes right after, this other one. We need to remember that when this was written, there was still a temple. Like for us today, okay, thousands of rams, streams of oil. These are what we would sacrifice. You would sacrifice rams, you would sacrifice oil, you would sacrifice meal. And okay, for me, this is a little bit of a historical curiosity. For them, it wasn't. There was no prayer in the synagogue. When you wanted to connect to God, what you did is you went, you brought your sacrifice to the temple, or sometimes you would do sacrifices, with the local priest, depending on the era. So for them, this was serious. This is all there was. This is before there was a written Torah. But still, that's not what God wants. I think
You know,
it's,
it's so interesting thinking about the challenges of translation. So often chesed is translated into English as loving kindness or something like that.
mhm,
And, in the Hebrew, it says like ahavat chesed, so like to love chesed. And, they don't translate chesed in this. It just says, love chesed. And it really gets into the challenge of like there's so much richness in the Hebrew, and English just in this instance at least cannot do it justice.
yeah. And I will say that I went back and throughout this course, everywhere that they translated Chesed, almost all the time, I just moved it back to Chesed because the translations probably said, love kindness or love, and that doesn't cover it, as you say.
No, it just
For
doesn't,
that
it's
reason.
so interesting, for a three-letter word, it just has so much in it. Actually,
Yeah.
a lot of three-letter words in Hebrew have so much in it. Um, yeah, that there really is no great translation,
And can I ask a
which is,
question?
please.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, so chesed is capitalized. Um, is
That's
that
by
because
me.
that's the essence of God?
I think so. I mean, I tend to capitalize chesed. I tend to capitalize, in my Musar hat, I tend to capitalize all soul traits, but I think it is worthy of being capitalized because it is a trait of God. And in my opinion, the central trait of God.
I think so.
And we've been talking throughout the class about walking in God's ways. And again, here we see lechet, to walk, you know, im Elohecha, with your God. Um, Striking comparison about what's more important. And so then in chapter 7, we get a little bit more Chesed. Mi el kamocha. So that to me, it's going back to Exodus, something else we say all the time. Mi kamocha ba'ilim Adonai, who is like you among the high ones or among the Elohim. So we're calling back to God's attributes and calling out, it's about forgiveness and remitting transgression and not staying angry forever. So we had the whole 13 attributes of God that we looked at. This is just kind of going right to that sort of last part that we kind of struggled with a little bit about the sins of the fathers and how they transmitted and blah blah blah. But here we're interpreting that it's really about not staying angry forever, and it's about again this idea of you know hafetz chesed, about loving chesed. Any more comments about Micah, or we will then head to Hosea. So Hosea 6:3. Um, Here we're going to contrast the JPS 1917 translation and the JPS 1985 translation. And I put these both into gender neutral language. So let us know, eagerly strive to know the divine. And again, here it is la da'at, to know, et Adonai, to know the divine. God's going forth as sure as the morning, and God shall come to us as rain, and the latter rain that watereth the earth. So, okay, 1917, but this I think ties into what we were looking at early on today, where there's this kind of we can count on God. There's a regularity, the rains are going to come, the morning's going to come. We can trust that it's going to be there. We need to know God's world. We need to know kind of how things work. And again, here we are back to this idea about in 1985 devotion to God. And we should become devout, et cetera, et cetera. And so then we see a similar sort of transformation. For I desire chesed and not sacrifice, and knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. And here again, we're seeing this idea of devotion, where I require goodness, not sacrifice, devotion to God rather than burnt offerings. So these are ideas that, we've talked about a bit. Again, it's about sort of knowing God, tying God into the universe and not wanting sacrifice. This is like very similar to what we were just looking at in Micah. It's about doing acts of chesed. It's not about doing the acts of law. So for the last part, and where we can end is we can talk about kind of, first of all, I want to hear your reactions to kind of the Hosea, and then, we'll spend a little time kind of where do we go with these teachings? We've talked, so first about Hosea. Any comments or things that strike you from this that maybe we hadn't?
Well, I just have a question
Yeah.
that came to my mind is, who are you when you desire chesed? Who are you when you sacrifice?
Mm.
So inside of us, maybe this is expressing where you would be coming from, as you are desiring chesed, rather than sacrifice is different, isn't it? 'Cause it makes me feel different when I think of sacrificing something as to opposed to desiring something. In other words, if I sacrifice it, I think I'm losing something, or it's something I'm giving, or something that's it's taken away from me. But when I desire something, it's more like running to that which will uh, make me better, make the world better. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Um, it does. Yeah. What I have some thoughts about that, but let me see. Sarah, do you have any comments on that? Do you want to jump in? No. So the Hebrew word for sacrifice, korban, it has an element of sort of drawing close. And so by giving up this ram or giving up, the grain or whatever it is, it allows us to draw close to the divine. So I think that was kind of some of the spirit of the word and the way it would have been thought of in biblical times. Um, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This was really serious. Like, this is how I draw close to God. This is sort of what I do when I've done something wrong or when I want to celebrate something and give gratitude for something. I would draw close to God by doing this sacrifice. And if I was really rich, I would bring like a bull or a ram. And if I was not, didn't have a lot of money, I could bring some grain or I could bring a bird or something. But that was kind of what we did. So in that context here, it's saying, but that's not what it's really about. I don't want these burnt offerings. I want you to connect to Chesed. It's a different emphasis. And so I think your question is so interesting. It's like, well, what is it? What is going on with me internally? Um, I don't know in that context, Wendy, what do you think would be going on in the internal world then?
If I only knew.
Hmm.
That's why they pay you the big bucks, Craig.
That's right. That's right. I think it's for me, I think there's maybe a little bit of an active versus a passive. It's more like I'm going to draw close to God in this moment as opposed to kind of going out and acting in the world.
Or maybe if I was in the place of giving a sacrifice of this ordinary part of life, and you know that you give this or that, it goes on, and then it becomes rote. It
Mhm.
becomes, oh yeah, I'll just do this. Oh yeah, I'll just do this, without a thoughtfulness being part of it. I
Yeah.
mean, I might have a tendency to do something like that because it's quicker and it's easier, and it's not as much as a sacrifice as thinking
Yeah.
through things.
Mm. That's right.
I think that, it's so easy for almost anything to become routine. Um, and I think the trick of living a more like spiritually present and sort of Hesed driven life is to think about what is the intention behind whatever your actions are. And perhaps that's why the word devotion was selected, is that, the translations are not perfect. And so there was some sense of, the word devotion having this stronger kind of power and emphasis in English that the Hebrew didn't quite
Mhm.
move from.
Yeah.
I love it that you said become routine, Sarah, because I got this picture of that being a way to slip into just using the law and just kind of being routine with it and oh, it's just it's so much richer to apply ourselves with an intention of Hesed, I think. Even
Mhm.
if you're following the law, I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I love the fact that you said it's easy to become routine, and that might be the problem right there.
Yeah. I'm reminded sort of at this, we're kind of at the end of the year and there's a lot of people, myself included, are doing a lot of, end of year giving and giving money to various charities, which is a great thing to do. But that's really, there's a big difference between giving money to the food bank and showing up and giving out food. And there's nothing wrong with giving money and it's essential, but there's something I think a little extra that comes from being there in person. It's giving up our time. It's giving an opportunity for connection with other people. I'm going to put up the last slide, which is a little bit of a summary, and then we can use kind of spend a few minutes kind of to talk about like what maybe you've taken away from the class and how you might want to apply this. So I've argued that kind of the team chesed, it's about walking in God's ways, emulating divine attributes, and going beyond what's required to help another person. It's about knowing God. It's about promoting human relationships and human welfare over blanket rules. Um, we can interpret the Torah and other Jewish texts in a way that centers chesed over mitzvot. And earlier in the class, like last week or last time we met when we looked at the book of Ruth, and there's this lovely lines that Ruth says to Naomi, wherever you go, I will go. And then the rabbis created this whole halachic discussion. It's like you're not allowed to go this place and that place. Okay, well, wherever you go, I'll go. And you're not allowed to eat these kinds of foods. Well, whatever you eat, I'll eat. And so that's a mitzvah-centric interpretation. Nothing wrong with that, but we can choose, what lens we want to bring to the text. And again, a focus on kindness, relationships, and invitation over obedience. Like you may be familiar with Rabbi Sharon Brous, who founded ICAR in LA. She is very, she does a lot of traditional Jewish practices. She walks to shul on Shabbat, she keeps kosher. But what she says again and again in her sermons is, I don't care if you do these things, I really don't. But boy, I get so much out of them. I get so much out of keeping kosher. I get so much out of not driving on Shabbat that I really invite you to try it out. And I hope maybe you'll get something out of it too. And so it's not to say that like following the mitzvot or following halakha is bad, but how do we invite how do we relate to other people who don't? Is it about invitation or is it like you're letting the whole team down and thousands of years of tradition ends with you because you're eating this cheeseburger and
No, I mean, it's really interesting, like the way, Rabbi Brous like frames it of, I think there are certain rules or laws that it can be hard to explain why is this the right thing to do. Um, in some ways because it's so obvious, like, don't murder someone. Great. Like, this is a heinous crime. Don't do it. Um, but then I think, with kashrut or with keeping Shabbat, I think especially in modernity, it can be hard to say like, well, why should I do that? And because it is the law, for I think for a lot of people, is not a good enough answer. But the idea of, because it's separating time, it's moments of reflection. For me, it's this, like, consider trying it is such a better way of inviting someone in than just telling them they're doing it wrong.
Mhm.
Um, it's so funny. Like, I have a nephew who's 4, and there's a lot of negotiating with a toddler. And so often it's like, if he's not interested in a food or interested in a thing, you just say like, well, why don't you try it? And even like that approach, it's interesting. I find like that approach that I have with him, I also have now employed with a lot of difficult adults, including at work. And it really does work. Like, there's something about, most people, I just don't think really want to be told what to do. But if you say, you know, give it a try, or here's why this works for me, like, you can feel yourself sort of opening to the idea in a much different way than just, you should do this or don't do that. um, I think, in our hearts and in our minds, humans are sort of curious people, and but we don't want to be told what to do unless, it kind of makes sense. At least I know for me, like, I really love a lot of explanation. And so
Mm,
saying like, okay, like, I do this and it works for me, give it a try. It's not like you must or you have to or you absolutely shouldn't, but just sort of an openness. And like I said, there's still some things where it's like, no, you absolutely should not do that. Um, but there's a lot that I think just needs to be explored. And an invitation to explore, I think, has like a generosity to it as well.
mhm. Yeah, I love that word generosity. And it was sort of interesting as I was listening to you. It's like, I almost wonder if like the team mitzvot, team chesed is like where you draw the line of like the stuff you should just do. Like we all agree you shouldn't murder people. And maybe for the people who are hardcore team law, it's like, and all the other stuff is you just shouldn't do that. I mean, it's a non sequitur to even talk about, not keeping kosher, not doing that because it's just stuff you should do. Whereas for other people, it's like, well, I don't do that for a variety of reasons, and it's not going to reach me to,
Like a little 4-year-old. The
yeah.
question, it's always why. When you were talking about the rabbi in LA, what's her name?
Rabbi Sharon Brous. She wrote a
Oh,
wonderful book, just came out this year called The Amen Effect.
It's Brous, Brous. The book is
uh,
wonderful.
well, when you were talking about her, I just got this big smile because it sounded like you were talking about Rabbi Nina. She's up here in Prescott, Arizona, and she does follow a lot of the kashrut, and I've seen people ask why, and she just turns to them and she just beams. It makes her happy. I thought, well, that's a why for her. That's really cool. And then also when the kids, I would say that maybe this is something that divine might say to us if we said, why? Well, I made that law rule because I love you.
Hmm.
I mean, it's the kids if they would ask why. And of course I would have the long explanation, which my kids always wanted the same as Sarah. They always wanted all the words. But the main reason was I love them. I love them.
I love you too, Mom, but I love the Oreos more, and why can't I have 6 of them? And yeah, but that's as good an answer as any. I like that. I mean, if you really think that like the divine is sort of loves us and has affection for us and cares about us, then It's like, oh, if that's really true, and this kind of was put forward as like something we should do out of caring and love, it kind of makes me think twice about it. It's like, oh, maybe I should give this a try. Maybe it is, I mean, it's funny, like in my family, we've sort of in the last couple months started eating pescatarian, and we really do feel better. You know, I mean, I love, it's not like I dislike meat and I do, but boy, I just feel more energetic and better. So, you know, diet is really important. Really matters what we eat for our health, for our energy, for our mental fitness. I mean, it all comes into play. And so if we take eating out of the realm of I need to, you know, eat this hamburger in the car while I'm driving to driving to my next appointment into something that's a little bit more sacred, um, that's relaxed and joyful. That's a really different look. So so what are some of your takeaways and how might you apply some of what we've talked about here, if at all?
Somehow I'm going to have to apply this to my relationship with my son, and I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, but I'll
Hmm,
figure it out. So thank you, Greg, for that.
thank you.
You know, it's so interesting. Like I work for a large homeless services provider, and I think a lot about kind of the balance of these two concepts of kind of law and chesed in the work that we do. And, you know, there's a lot of, you know, sort of rules around, you know, local and state and county and federal government and, you know, how people are counted and the different metrics and the things that feel, excuse me, very frankly not very human centered.
Hmm,
And then, you know, at the end of the day, all of those numbers represent people.
hmm,
And the story of people's lives. And frankly, you know, we're working with people during what are hopefully the most difficult periods of their life and then moving them towards much better. um, and so really trying to keep kind of Hesed in the center. I mean, it's a secular organization, but you know,
yeah,
I can
yeah.
use that terminology. um, and thinking about how all of those numbers and the finances and the, you know, the sort of operational side is really about people, including the staff as well. And sometimes that can get lost, you know, because we're a big organization. Um, and so really trying to think about how I keep kind of the concept of chesed and the sort of why we do what we do and how we do it and the people sort of centered and focused, is something that I really want to bring into sort of this the new calendar year,
Hmm.
and try to keep with me during my day-to-day work life. So this has been really, um, it's been opening for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Hmm.
You know, I'll just say, particularly Greg, when you were talking about, you know, you can sort of donate money and that's great, but you can also do. And I think, you know, so much of what I think about in terms of doing is like, how do you see the humanity in people? Like, I think there is a way, particularly when you donate money, that it can feel sort of like you're creating distance. Like you're saying, like, well, I helped, but you're not thinking about who you helped and what the circumstances are. And um, you know, thinking about the sort of person to person connection. And I, especially in the work that I do, I think about that a lot too, of like, how do you, like, well, of course, you know, we need money to run, you know, to run our organization and, you know, to pay people and to feed people and shelter them and do provide a whole variety of supportive services. Um, Thinking about, you know, all of our clients as, you know, also, you know, people created in the divine, I think sometimes is missing, even from some of our most generous donors. Um, that thinking about, you're not actually so different.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really important point. And it shoot, I forgot what I was gonna say. You were talking about kind of remembering that they're people and oh, I know what it was. It just was making me think about when my wife used to work for Genentech and like they always would bring in patients to talk about how the drugs had saved their life or improved their life. And I think we as humans, we really respond well to that sort of human connection. But it's so much easier when it's a, hey, I had breast cancer and I had some kids and now I'm going to live and et cetera, to someone who's, is unhoused and is having like, all kinds of struggles, which, maybe aren't as heroic. And, or maybe there's just stories that are just as inspirational. I don't know, but
Being a grant writer, I love asking people for money,
mm,
and the connection to me is their heart.
mm,
And my husband and I are so happy and grateful that somehow, some way, we didn't know anything, but we now have enough money to actually give to the nonprofits and organizations that and to Temple, and that we did not. That was one of the things about retirement that was really hard
mm,
for us. We weren't going to have what we thought we would have, and yet we have it.
mm,
And so when we give money to like Mogan David, uh, Adam, uh, or other things, or the temple, then it's through this connection. I don't feel disconnected to it. Is what I'm trying to say. And I think that the donors that I have found through the years through grant writing, they're connected too, which is one of the reasons I love grant writing is because you make that connection for them. They can see the humanity, and it's a great thing. And to also go and do, there's nothing like that. It's also very personal. So it's beautiful, and it just reminds me of Hesed a lot. But I think about money a little differently than a lot of people because I'm not like, ew. It's never been like that. I'm just like, I love asking people for money.
mm,
And some of the people that I call to get on a committee said to me, I'll do anything for you, but I won't ask people for money.
mm.
Don't worry about that. I'll take care of that part. But it is interesting that you just if you have that connection, that human connection and that humanity, it's like what Sarah and you were both saying. It makes all the difference.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here. And I'm sure we could continue this conversation for a while, but I unfortunately need to call a stop. So I really appreciate both of you being a part of this class. I really loved teaching it. I learned a lot from both of you. If to the people who might be watching the recording, if you're still watching, thank you so much. I hope that you've learned a lot. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at Greg at rabbigregmarcus.com or swing by the website if you want to watch some more videos or do some additional learning. And with that, I will
Thank
say
you.
thank you.
And thank you to the fellow classmates and Greg. Thank you and Happy New Year and also happy birthday.
Thank
Was
you.
it your birthday today?
It was my birthday yesterday.
Oh,
And it's my birthday today.
It
Sarah, happy birthday.
is.